Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our online event, Maine's Environment in the 2024 Legislative Session. My name is Rebecca Sanders, and I am the CEO of the Natural Resources Council of Maine. NRCM is Maine's largest environmental advocacy organization, and we harness the power of the law, science, and the voices of people all around the state of Maine to protect Maine's climate, wildlife, water, and the outdoors. I'm joined today by our team of staff advocates and experts who are going to share our top priorities for this legislative session to protect our climate, our water, and the outdoors and Maine's communities. I want to first acknowledge that all of our work is conducted on the unceded territory of the Wabanaki people, who have stewarded this land for centuries before forcible removal by colonial settlers. We acknowledge tribal sovereignty and recognize its significance for the Wabanaki people. And you'll hear more about how we're supporting tribal sovereignty in the legislature this year. But beyond that bill, we also know it's important to work with our partners in the Wabanaki nations across all of our issues on land, air, water, and wildlife. NRCM is committed to working alongside you to use our voice, our resources, and our power to do this. Now, before we dive in and hear from our speakers, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. This event's going to be recorded and will be up on our YouTube channel. So if there's something that you didn't catch the first time and you want to go back and listen to, it will be there for you. Or if you want to pass this along to people in your friend and local community networks. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please drop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your page instead of the chat. And we'll get to those at the end of the presentations. And we'll be monitoring the chat and can also pull some questions from there if they slip in. I'm going to pass this over to our advocacy director, Pete Didesheim, who's going to give us an orientation to what's happening in the legislature this session. Thanks, Pete. Take it away.
Thanks, Rebecca. And thanks everybody who's on this call. Thanks for your interest in the environmental work that we do at the State House, and I am hoping that all of you stay engaged throughout this legislative session and respond to our action alerts and help us win as much as we can. We're already 3 weeks into this session, and the pace of activity already is pretty fast and furious. Lawmakers have about 500 bills to process, and they hope to adjourn by April 17th. And my guess, if the past is any prediction of where they're gonna when they're gonna finish, they'll probably pull an all-nighter on their last day. That's usually what they do. They did that last year, and we were there. Jack was there at 2:36 a.m. or whatever it was when the offshore wind bill made it across the finish line as a really big win. So we're tracking about 60 bills, and there's hearings and work sessions happening almost daily. We're testifying on a couple of bills today. We testified on a couple of bills yesterday. And just at the outset, let me just say that for a number of reasons, we're predicting that we'll make some modest progress this year. But it's I think our predictions are just that, modest. We don't have big expectations that this is going to be a year when we're going to pass a lot of bills. And that's for a few reasons. Why don't we move to the next slide? So one of the reasons is that we've had so many victories since 2019. This has been one of the most productive pro-environment stretches of legislative activity, probably in the past 4 decades. And last year at this time, I predicted a bunch of big wins, and those happened on offshore wind and the bottle bill and habitat protection. And because of the bills that we've passed, many of the state agencies are scrambling to keep up with the implementation activities, and they're feeling really stretched in terms of their financial resources and their staff capacity. So it's not that we don't have additional big wins, but it's the agencies are urging a little bit of a pause while they catch up with their implementation work. In the last 5 years, we've passed more than 100 positive bills and spending measures, and that contrasts with the previous 8 years where we worked to defeat 100 bad bills. But we may have a few big wins this year, and we'll get into some of those, but we'll definitely have some small victories and already have made some progress. So next slide. The reason we'll continue to make forward motion partly is because of the distribution of votes. These two graphs show the balance of control of the House of Representatives on the top and the balance in the Senate on the bottom. And we work hard to achieve a bipartisan majority on all of our bills. But the record shows that the Democrats tend to be more aligned with our bills. And so for those bills that need a simple majority to get out of committee and through the House and Senate and to the governor's desk, many of those will pass through this session and represent steps forward. And we work with some fantastic lawmakers. There's a composite of images of some of the ones we work with, and we just rely on them so much, and they're deeply committed to keeping our agenda moving forward. And so we'll have some wins because those lawmakers care about continued progress in the protection of Maine's environment. Next slide. So this is also called the emergency session. They're only supposed to be paying attention to bills that are true emergencies. That's in the eye of the beholder and in the eye of the party that controls the House and Senate. So all sorts of bills are going to be considered in those 500 that are not emergencies. But clearly the storms that we've had over the last month do represent emergencies. There was an emergency meeting of the Climate Council yesterday with the governor to discuss the impact of these climate-induced storms on infrastructure, working waterfronts, inland trails, roadways, bridges, all sorts of impacts. And because of that meeting yesterday, there's an uncertainty about how the supplemental budget will be structured to try to address some of those issues moving forward. And the next slide. Because this is an election year and it's a presidential election year, the work at the State House is not going to escape the shadow of those larger forces. Lawmakers are going to be eager to get out on time. But there's also just a more charged environment. There's more hot button issues. There's more partisan dynamics. We're already seeing a good bit of that at the State House. We'll see more of that. Some of the issues that are going to be pursued, gun safety, housing, how to spend the supplemental budget, abortion rights, those will all be heavily contested. There'll be a lot of turnout of partisan perspectives on these issues, and that does spill over into some of our work, and that probably also will be a limiting factor on our ability to really push our big issues through this year. But as you'll hear from the staff who are about to jump in, we do anticipate making some progress, and we appreciate your involvement in helping us make that happen. So why don't I hand it off to the first in line for our panel.
Thanks, Pete. I'm going to pass this over to Josh Caldwell, who is our outreach coordinator for our climate and clean energy program. Josh, thank you.
Thanks so much, Rebecca, and thanks everyone for being here. Yeah, my name is Josh, and I am the Climate and Clean Energy Outreach Coordinator. There was a hearing for this bill yesterday, and the director of our program, Jack Shapiro, was really leading the charge in favor of this bill, and he wishes he could be here today, but was at the State House very late last night at this hearing and is in transit today, so sends his best. I'll do my best to step in his stead. So quickly on this bill, it came to be because as we respond to climate change and contribute to our clean energy transition, we cannot continue to expand fossil fuel infrastructure and subsidize fossil fuels. Natural gas is a relatively small portion of Maine's heating mix, but the gas system comes with some significant problems for climate, of course, but also for health and for ratepayers long term. And if we can go to the next slide, Kristen. So gas is mostly methane, and it's referred to as natural gas by the industry, but would more likely or more accurately be called methane or fracked gas. And methane is a climate superpolluter. That is, it can capture more than 80 times the heat per pound than carbon dioxide can over the first 20 years that it enters the atmosphere. And another issue, it's a pressurized gas and it leaks. It leaks through the system from wells, transmission pipelines, distribution mains, and service lines and appliances within the home. So even a small amount of methane leakage could be a serious threat to Maine as a state to achieving our climate goals and staving off some of the worst impacts of climate change. Impacts that we've all seen have gotten worse over the past few months and the past year. But here's the problem. The gas system in Maine is actually expanding. It's fueled by subsidies for new connections, risking locking in emissions for decades. We're seeing commitments to utilities that are up to 30 years long, and we can't continue to make those commitments to fossil fuel infrastructure. So gas expansion either means we fail to achieve our climate goals, or we end up with a vastly overbuilt and expensive system. These are called stranded assets when we overbuild. And if we don't limit gas expansion and really thoughtfully plan for the future, our success on climate and electrification through things like the widespread adoption of heat pumps will mean that ratepayers get stuck on the gas system in the future and will have to pay exorbitant costs to pay off those pipes that are no longer needed but have been implemented. Climate is not the only problem with gas, as you'll see on this slide. Burning fossil fuels inside our homes creates terrible indoor air pollution that is largely undercounted and understudied. Nitrogen oxides associated with gas stoves alone have been shown to be responsible for 13% of childhood asthma cases nationwide, which is 1 in 8 kids, or 1 in 8 cases of asthma, I should say. Gas that trickles out of appliance fixtures have been shown to lead to or to include carcinogens like benzene, and this kind of indoor air pollution affects children and other vulnerable populations disproportionately. There's an environmental justice aspect to this as well. And really, gas is not more affordable either, despite what gas companies say. The 4 cheapest ways to heat your home, according to Efficiency Maine, are 3 different kinds of heat pumps and wood stove combinations. Maine's most recent energy burden study found that low-income households that heat with gas pay 60% more per year for energy than households that heat with electricity. It's even cheaper to build a new house without gas infrastructure than with it, notable in Maine, where we desperately need more housing. So if we can jump to the next slide, I'll share a little bit about what this bill that we're working on specifically does. So first and foremost, it ends existing subsidies for adding new customers to the gas system and limits utilities' ability to expand their systems into new municipalities. It also initiates studies of health impacts of indoor fossil fuel use, alternatives like neighborhood geothermal networks, and a formal inquiry at the Public Utilities Commission on how gas utilities could operate economically in a way that protects ratepayers and is consistent with Maine's statutory emissions reduction targets. Transitioning towards clean energy and electrification and away from fossil fuels in home heating and cooking will not be easy, we know that, but we have to approach this in as thoughtful and as fair a way as possible. By obeying the first law of holes, when you find yourself in one, stop digging. LD 2077 takes a reasonable approach to limit risks to our climate, to our health, and to our ratepayers. I'll now hand it over to our next presenter. Thanks so much.
So Melanie, it's over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Hi, I'm Melanie Sturm, the Forest and Wildlife Director at NRCM. Nice to have you all here. I'm here to tell you about the Maine Trails Bond, which is the first ever opportunity for the state to invest in trails. It would help make Maine a national leader in recreational and multi-use trails that bolster local economies, strengthen community connections, and improve our quality of life. LD 1156 is sponsored by Representative Fay of Raymond and Senator Black of Franklin County, and it would provide $30 million over 4 years in competitive grant funding to towns, organizations, and clubs for the design, construction, and maintenance of trails. Next slide. Maine is known for its wild beauty and close-knit towns, but we're underinvesting in the infrastructure trails that get Mainers and visitors outside to enjoy those places and move around their communities. recent damaging storms this winter that Pete mentioned have exacerbated some existing problems, which is that many trails are beaten up and they're not getting the care they need. Many trails aren't accessible for people of all abilities. And we're relying on volunteers alone to fix those problems. That's just not sustainable. So increased use means we need new trails too. No one likes a crowded trailhead. I know I don't. So it's not just about maintenance, it's designing new trails that are accessible and durable in the face of intense weather events. People need ways to get outside and travel from place A to place B safely. Every county is suffering from a lack of adequate funding to address maintenance backlogs and to see new trail projects to fruition. Next slide. Trails support economic development, especially in rural areas of the state. They're the backbone of Maine's $8.2 billion outdoor recreation economy, and snowmobiling alone provides an estimated $600 million annually to Maine's economy. Investing in trails would pay dividends by giving people more of a reason to visit rural communities like Bethel, Monson, Skowhegan, Down East, Aroostook County throughout the year to check out trails and to spend money while they're there. Next slide. The Maine Trails Bond offers a solution to those problems that I just mentioned. It has the support from an incredible almost 500 towns, businesses, and organizations that you can see here on the map. You can see where they're located here on the map anyway, including some of the state's largest retailers, mom and pop shops, outfitters, guide services, ATV and snowmobile clubs, and about 60 municipalities. That support speaks to the important role trails play in communities and to the economy, and we're fortunate to have some incredible or just practical trails all over, but as I mentioned, they're falling into disrepair and the need for investment is bigger than ever. So my final pitch to you is that being a bond bill, LD 1156 requires 2/3 vote in the House and Senate. We need support from both sides of the aisle on this, which won't be easy. So we need your help. Please contact your lawmakers and urge their support for LD 1156. If that bill passes, that means Maine people will have a chance to vote on the Trails Bond this November. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Melanie, for sharing. It's such a critical part of, I think, how so many of us experience nature in Maine is getting out there, and it's our responsibility to make sure that our trails are taken care of. So thank you for the work you're leading. I will pass this over to Nick Bennett, the director of our Healthy Waters program and NRCM's chief scientist. And Nick has some really good news to share 3 weeks into the session.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yes, I do have some good news. LD 2003, which is a bill that would have allowed industrial rockweed harvesting along the Maine coast without landowner permission, has been withdrawn by Senator Jackson, and he's the Senate president, and asked that the bill be voted ought not to pass in the Marine Resources Committee. So we had expected this would be a bill that would involve a major fight right down to the wire, and now it won't. And we're extremely grateful to the Senate president and very relieved that this bill is off our plate. This is not the first time this bill has showed up. I'll just give you a quick bit of background about rockweed. Rockweed, as I think many of you know, is the stuff that you slip on and fall when you walk along the coast and clamber on the rocks. It is a keystone species in Maine. More than 100 species of animals depend on rockweed habitat. Over the last 20 years or so, rockweed harvesting has increased dramatically. Much of it done with mechanized harvesters, depending on where you are in the state. And there's really been very little regulation of that, except more recently in Cobscook Bay. However, in 2019, the law court, which is the state's Supreme Court, ruled that rockweed belonged to the owner of the intertidal zone, the upland owner, and that therefore removal of rockweed without landowner permission is theft. And this has served as a check on some of the more egregious overharvesting that has been happening over the last 15 or 20 years. This harvesting has also happened on land trust land, where land trusts have expressly purchased coastal land for the purposes of preserving rockweed beds, and literally someone will come in and look at their coastal property in the morning and the rockweed's gone because harvesters came in and took it when no one was looking. And that kind of stuff really needs to stop. Ever since the law court found in 2019 that rockweed harvest required permission, or rockweed harvest in the intertidal zone required permission, the rockweed industry has fought that. And they have proposed several times bringing a bill forward that would force the law court to re-examine its position, and they hope overrule its position, once again allowing the free-for-all that's existed for a long time in terms of harvesting rockweed. Not all rockweed harvest is necessarily dangerous. Rockweed is something that Mainers have used for a long time, but the scale is what has changed over the last couple of decades. And given our lack of regulation of rockweed, this private ownership of rockweed has served as a check on some of the worst abuses of the industry, which is very poorly regulated. I should say this is a lovely picture of fish in rockweed at high tide. This is why we want to continue to have a robust rockweed intertidal habitat system along the coast. It's very important for Maine's coastal ecology, for many of Maine's fish species, for the eiders that you saw on the first slide. And unfortunately, this fight is not over. There's no doubt in my mind that this same bill will be back next session. And there are a whole lot of different strategies that we need to work on to keep our rockweed forests intact. One of the heroes of this long-term battle has been the woman that you see in glasses teaching a class on rockweed to some kids near Pembroke, and that's Robin Hadlock Seeley. She's a Conservation Award, Leadership Award winner of NRCM's, and she's really been instrumental in getting the word out about how important habitat is, rockweed habitat is, and also she's been very involved in documenting illegal rockweed harvests. So we owe a lot to Robin in terms of protecting this important coastal resource for Maine. Thanks. I'll turn it over to the next presenter.
Thank you, Nick. This goes back to you, Josh, to give us an update on tribal sovereignty. It's been quite a journey.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Certainly. So we're now shifting gears to talk about a priority that has really been in the mix for the past few years now, which is tribal sovereignty. The first thing that I want to say about this bill and really about this movement is that the tribes and their allies have assembled a campaign that rivals any in the nation in terms of diversity, strength, and commitment. This has been an incredible organizing effort over the past few years, and we're really, really honored to have been a part of it. A lot of work has been conducted through the Wabanaki Alliance, which you may be familiar with, which is a tribal-led organization that has pulled together over 200 organizations and businesses across the state in a really impressive coalition seeking to restore self-determination to the tribes here in Maine. I'll make sure to put the Wabanaki Alliance website in the chat after I finish talking here so that you can go check out some of that great work yourself. We can go to the next slide, Kristen. So as I mentioned, the tribes in Maine have been advocating for sovereignty for years now. In 2019, a bipartisan task force called the Maine Indian Claims Task Force produced a report that included 22 recommendations about how to revise and improve the relationship between the state of Maine and the 4 federally recognized tribes in Maine. Back in 1980, to give a little context, the Maine Indian Land Claim Settlement Act established a unique relationship between the 4 tribes in Maine and the state of Maine. So there are 574 tribes in the United States. 4 of them are here in Maine. The other 570 federally recognized tribes in the nation are treated as sovereign and engage with the United States in a nation-to-nation relationship. Here in Maine, however, the 4 tribes are treated more like municipalities and therefore do not have the ability to regulate and oversee their lands, community, and culture independently from the state. This prevents tribes from establishing their own environmental regulations, accessing federal funds and programs designed for tribal entities, and really determining their own path forward as tribal and historic communities. So there have been a few iterations of this bill since 2019. I know a lot of you out there have been keeping track with this movement. And this year we know that that bill is going to be LD 2007 and will again contain some version of those 22 recommendations from the bipartisan task force, with a primary objective being restoring sovereignty to the 4 tribes here in the state of Maine. There has not yet been a hearing on this bill, and the final language of the bill is not yet set. The reason for that is that internal negotiations continue between the tribes and tribal consultants and legislators to determine what can be supported by at least 2/3 of the House and the Senate. The reason that this needs to be supported by 2/3 is that the current administration has been one of the primary obstacles to achieving sovereignty, and Governor Mills has indicated that she will likely veto the bill if it comes to her desk. So a 2/3 vote would insulate against such a veto and override a veto, which would ensure enactment of the bill. So this is really an effort to establish a bipartisan majority in support of tribal sovereignty. And a lot of that work has been done and is really impressive. I would note in particular that House Minority Leader Billy Bob Fockingham is a really great supporter of tribal sovereignty and is a Republican legislator and has been seeking to get his caucus on board. This is a challenging issue, but I think there are a lot of issues around sovereignty that resonate across the political spectrum. So I'll close by saying that we know the tribes have been really negatively impacted by their current status. A report by the Harvard Kennedy School found that in comparing the per capita income of tribal members in Maine relative to tribal members outside of the state since 1989, the average per capita income for tribes in Maine has risen by 9% since that date, relative to a rise of 61% for tribes outside of Maine. So this has really direct economic implications for the tribes, but we also can avoid the social and environmental justice implications for not having the right to self-determine for these communities. So it is really past time that self-determination is restored for the tribes in Maine, and we are really honored to be a part of that effort with all of you. Please do take a moment to check out the Wabanaki Alliance website. They post regular action alerts, and we'll also do our best to keep you informed as we continue on this really important bill. So I'll go ahead and find that website for all of you, and I'll pass it back to our next presenter.
Thanks, Josh. Thank you for giving us an update and for your tireless work on this, both within NRCM and in the legislature and with partners at the Wabanaki Alliance. We are going to be joined over video by one of our advocates, Vanessa Berry, on the Sustainable Maine program. Vanessa is unable to join us today because she's over at the State House advocating on our issues, but she has an update that she'd like to share.
Hello, everyone. I'm so sorry I can't be with you all today for this webinar due to a packed agenda in the legislature, but I'm so happy to be able to talk with you all about LD 2091, an act regarding businesses and consumers' use of returnable, reusable, and refillable containers for food, beverages, and non-food items, a bill sponsored by Senator Nicole Grahowski. To get things started, I'd love to talk about the background for this bill and why reuse is so important. Maine recently released a waste generation and landfill capacity report that states that the amount of household waste that is being disposed of in landfills and incinerators is increasing, while recycling rates remain stagnant at around 33.8%. Even when accounting for the increase in Maine's population in recent years, the amount of waste per capita is also increasing, meaning that everyone is making more trash. I use this analogy often when talking about waste, but the amount of waste we create is an overflowing bathtub. We often talk about recycling and composting when discussing solutions to this problem, but those serve as the mop and the bucket that we use to help us bail the water. The real solutions help us turn off the tap and cut this problem off at the source. And reuse is a great way to prevent the creation of unnecessary wasteful plastic packaging and slow down the creation of our trash. Rather than relying on the cleanup tools like recycling to help us with our problem, we should encourage more reuse and repair in Maine. This is also an integral part of Maine's culture. We see reuse with items on Facebook Marketplace, at yard sales and thrift stores, and even in your kitchen when you use real silverware and dishes. Consumers don't want their taxes to pay for disposing of packaging, and many Maine people want businesses to offer reusable dishes and packaging over disposables for a lot of reasons. Many Maine businesses want to offer reuse, but the current health inspection program does not have the language that allows for reuse in many of the ways that these businesses need. This is why NRCM supports LD 2091, which would make necessary changes to modernize the state of Maine health inspection program's refilling returnables policy, and it'll allow for other models of reuse in Maine. There are lots of benefits to supporting reuse for businesses here in Maine. Reusable dishes and containers are a one-time expense that can save hundreds for businesses or even thousands of dollars over the lifetime of those containers. And reuse can often be a safer option for food storage compared to other types of single-use packaging. Reuse also allows for local washing and recirculating of packaging, which can save towns money on their solid waste budgets. As mentioned earlier, reuse is also a solution to many of our current waste problems, replacing the need for many disposable items that will take up space in landfills. Reusable items can also help achieve Maine's climate goals, preventing the need for continued manufacturing of fossil fuel-derived plastics and keeping the materials in circulation locally. Lastly, reuse can be a much better experience for consumers. Reusable containers are an investment for businesses that are made to be more durable and made from higher quality materials. Reuse is a budding industry across the country and in other areas around the world. Creating opportunities for reuse allows for job creation, and businesses expand to tackle commercial washing of containers, logistics for reuse at events, technology to help keep track of containers, and so much more. Here at NRCM, we're really excited about the possibilities that this bill could provide for businesses who already want to do this work, and we look forward to a future with more reuse if this bill passes. Before I wrap things up, I want to thank you all for joining us today as we share our legislative priorities. I'm happy to connect with folks after the webinar to answer any questions you may have, and I hope to see many of you at NRCM State House Action Day in March. Go reuse.
All right, and with that very energetic video, we have come to the close of our summary out to you, but this is the interactive part of the session together, where we'd like you to be able to ask questions and have access to our experts on staff to respond. So this is if you could take a few moments and submit your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And while you're doing that, I'm going to give you a couple of updates. First, there's lots of opportunities to be engaged with us throughout the session and throughout the year. Perhaps the most exciting and empowering one is to join us on Tuesday, March 5th for State House Action Day. That is a full morning and of activity where we gather as a community, we talk about our priorities, And then we spend time at the State House, and you're able to speak directly to your legislators about the issues that you care about. We hope that you will join us, and we will include some links for registration when those are up and ready. We also hope that you'll sign up for the NRCM action alerts. We send opportunities to submit testimony, to call and email your legislators, or to sign petitions on active bills. Your voice is incredibly important to making sure that we are passing the laws that protect Maine's environment. And so we really encourage you to engage as much as you can through those tools that we send out. And then last, we have a really incredible website that is in some ways like an encyclopedia of Maine's environmental history. And we have a bill tracking page up there that shows the status of our bills, a Take Action toolkit that will share some ways for you to submit testimony if you do that independently from us. And there's a whole lot of other things there that you can explore. So please take the time to go online and look at our website. We're going to shift now to the Q&A. And if we don't get to your question today, we will follow up with email. So I'm going to pass our first question over to Melanie about Trails Bond. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more, Melanie, about how the Trails Bond money would be implemented, and if any of those funds would be immediately available to help assess and address the damage from the recent storms over the last couple of months.
Sure. So the bond, if it were passed by voters in November, would make $30 million over 4 years available to be administered through the Bureau of Parks and Lands. That's $7.5 million per year for 4 years. Given the timing, we're looking several months down the line. Voters would need to pass this, like I said, in November. And then there's always a bureaucratic moving around of money. So it would be quite some time before this money could be in the hands of towns or clubs who would use it to repair trails that were damaged recently. So yes, it could be used by those folks if they were awarded the funding, but it is a competitive grant program too. So the answer is yes, but maybe not.
Thank you, Melanie. Josh, we have some questions about the natural gas bill, and I'm wondering if you could share if there are other models in other states of this kind of legislation, and then maybe talk a little bit more in depth about the politics of where we see challenges and opportunities here in the legislature and with the governor's office.
Yeah, sure. I think the best examples that we've seen are in Massachusetts and New York, which are relatively nearby. Both of them have passed or are working on legislation recently that is similar to the efforts that we're trying to do here. There are also several states out there that are conducting studies that are similar to the studies that we want to conduct to better understand methane gas leaks and the implications of expanding gas infrastructure. A lot of people view natural gas as what they reference as a bridge fuel. So between propane, which emits at a higher rate, and electrification. Our view is that electrification combined with appropriate weatherization and energy efficiency measures is the most cost-effective and the most climate-effective solutions available to us right now, which is why we're pursuing this bill. In terms of obstacles and in terms of just working through the legislative process, what we heard a lot at the hearing yesterday from those who are opposed to the bill is that they would like to see the results of these studies come before halting the expansion of the natural gas system. Our response to that, and I think we articulated it fairly well in the hearing, is that we've seen the impacts of climate change this past year. 2023 was the hottest year on record by a large margin, and we can't afford to continue investing in fossil fuels while conducting these studies. So it's really important that we put a halt on that expansion and study the impacts of current natural gas infrastructure. As with the whole legislative process, the committee, the Energy, Utilities, and Technology Committee, will assess all of the feedback they heard at the hearing yesterday, and then come back for work session where a lot of these elements of the bill will be hammered out. We're going to continue to push for the full bill, but I know that that expansion piece, halting expansion, is probably going to be the piece that is going to be the most contended. I think most people are excited about the prospect of these studies that will help us better understand the implications of natural gas. I hope that answered the question there.
That's great, Josh. Thank you so much. Nick, we have a question about rockweed, and I'm wondering if you could just give us a baseline of like, why is rockweed being harvested? What is it used for? What's the demand in the market for it?
So rockweed has for a very long time been used as a soil amendment, essentially as fertilizer. And people who live near the coast have used it in their gardens. That kind of use is very old. With the mechanization and industrialization of rockweed, it's now used as supplements in animal feed, so fairly large scale agriculture. It's used also as liquid. It's transformed into a liquid and used as liquid fertilizer, again, on a fairly large scale. And it's also used to make food additives.
Thank you, Nick. Pete, we have a question that we're going to send over to you about LD 1817, the Maine Outdoor School for All bill. And I'm wondering if you could just share what our position is on that and how we plan to engage with that.
So that's a bill that that was introduced last year. It received a very positive report out of committee. It went through the House and Senate and landed on what's called the appropriations table, where lots of bills end up that need funding. And at the end of last legislative session, there was maybe $1 billion worth of bills on the appropriations table, and they only had about $20 million worth of money available in the budget to spend. So I believe the Outdoor School for All's bill might require a couple $1 million. I don't have the number right in my head. So it was competing against so many other bills that also require money. We support the concept. It's designed after an approach in Oregon that's has worked very well in getting school-age kids into the outdoors. We think that's a really important and fantastic priority to expose children early and often to the natural world. I would have to predict that its prospects are not great, just given the continued competition for funding, but we certainly are supportive of it.
Thanks, Pete. And I know there have been some questions about specific bills that we're tracking. You can see all of those again on our bill tracking page on our website, and we may have dropped it in the chat, but if we haven't, we will, or we will again. I have a question for you again, Nick. You spend a lot of your time, and we spent a lot of time talking about mining, and you had some priorities around mining bills in the last session. Could you share what mining bills might be in this session and how we're engaging with those?
Sure. So there will possibly be a bill related to mining. It won't really be a bill. It will be a question of approving or disapproving rules related to deposits that are not sulfide deposits that produce acid. So these rules come out of interests and concerns about the deposit in Newry that could supply lithium for industrial purposes. These rules have nothing to do with Wolf Den or any other kind of mine that's in an acid generating ore body. So the Board of Environmental Protection has already heard DEP's proposed rules about what kind of sampling you need to do and what kind of monitoring you need to do prior to excavating a deposit like the one in Newry. And that hearing happened last week, and there'll be some deliberation at the Board of Environmental Protection about those rules in the near future. And then the legislature will hold a hearing on the rules that the board adopts provisionally, and people will have the opportunity to comment on that. Whether or not they can actually beat the clock and get these rules in front of the legislature before they adjourn in April or perhaps early May, that remains to be seen. So that would be your opportunity to comment on rules that have something to do with Newry. Again, they have nothing to do with Picket Mountain or Wolfton.
Thanks, Nick. And thanks for your hard work on that. Pete, we've talked about a number of priority bills for us in this session. Can you give us an overview of where you think we're going to have some good success and where you think we might have some challenges and really need people's voices?
Well, one bill that we didn't mention that we're pretty excited about, I think it's going to go through fine. It'll be within the appropriations bill, the governor's the governor's office of policy innovation in the future, also referred to as GOPIF, is developing a new independent office called the Maine Office of Community Affairs that'll be somewhat analogous to the state planning office that was dismantled in 2011 by the LePage administration. This new office is going to have within it kind of a consolidation of planning staff and the climate resilience program, and focus on helping communities deal with climate impacts and resiliency and planning challenges and assistance in helping get federal funding and other grant programs. This is going to be a victory. I'm pretty sure that it'll pass through. It won't get a lot of attention. It'll take probably a year or two to create the office, but we're excited about that. I think we'll succeed in stopping rollback bills. I think we're already off to a good start with the Rockweed bill. I also saw in the chat, there was this emergency meeting with the governor yesterday focused on the impact of these 3 consecutive storms that have had such an impact. And the video link for that is definitely worth watching. It was an extremely important and compelling and troubling in some ways meeting. Many messengers from communities from Stonington and Deer Isle and in Bethel and Hollowell, describing just the scale of impacts of these 3 storms, and describing these are really multi-hazard events: power outages, impacts on drinking water, flooding, impacts on road closures, power outages, more than 450,000, business impacts, mental health impacts. I'm somewhat optimistic that this will translate into funding in the supplemental appropriations that will be for the purpose of improving climate resiliency in the face of these sort of storms, which are going to keep coming at us. I'm optimistic we are going to get this Trails Bond passed. This is one of the broadest coalitions we've ever been involved with towns, businesses, trail clubs, and organizations that are as diverse as anything we've done. That's one where we really need everybody to weigh in with their legislator. We need 18 Republicans to join with all the Democrats. I'm assuming that all the Democrats will be supportive of this. So this is a really important rural economic, but also outdoor recreation investment. And I think that some of the lower profile bills dealing with sustainability, reducing plastic pollution, reuse, some of the utility and energy bills also will pass through, that will also be positive for us. So it's a quick overview. I think our team is definitely focused on moving forward, and we will definitely take steps forward with the hope of taking a few big ones.
Thanks, Pete. That's really great. We're all really excited about the Trails Bond and the possibility it brings for people all across the state of Maine. It's really powerful. Josh, I have a question for you around tribal sovereignty. And it's a question I think we run into quite a bit, which is about, what has changed, what conditions have changed from the time of the 1980 legislation to the recent efforts for tribal sovereignty. Can you speak to that?
Yes, absolutely. So in 1980, the Maine Indian Land Claim Settlement Act was established, and I think, as noted in the comments, it was voluntarily entered into by the tribes. But as with a lot of treaties between our state infrastructure and tribes historically, this was a time when the tribes were in desperate need, particularly of cash, and that settlement enabled them to gain access to some resources that were more immediately needed at the time. But the long-term implications have proven over the past 44 years now, not to be beneficial. I think it wasn't foreseen that throughout the course of that time, several hundred pieces of federal legislation that would benefit tribes nationally would not be able to be accessed by the tribes in Maine. So that's one of the predominant ones. The tribes in Maine have been prevented from accessing a lot of federal legislation over that time. And so this task force was reconvened in 2019 to determine, whether the Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement still stands up or not. And basically, these 22 recommendations that came out of that task force shared the ways in which that Land Claim Settlement Act needs to be updated in order to reflect the current needs of the tribes here in Maine. So, this is a political process. There are certainly a lot of changes that have happened over the past 43 years, and the tribes have indicated that it would be much better for their communities that they be treated as a sovereign nation.
Gosh. We're going to close out with one last question for you, Melanie, which is about the trails bond and accessibility. How do you envision the trails bond being used to increase accessibility to Maine's trails so that everyone in the state has access to the outdoors?
That's a good question. So it's hard to know exactly which trail projects will be funded because these proposals will come forward from towns and organizations like we've talked about. I do know that one of the core criteria of the funding in order for an applicant to receive grant funds is for the trails to meet sustainable design standards and accessibility standards. So that any applicant who puts forward a trail project for potential funding will have to explain how accessibility will be addressed in the design of their trail. And then again, it's hard to say which trails and which part of the state will be funded, but it has to be a consideration for the administrator of these grants, of these grant funds.
Thanks, Melanie. With that, I think we are going to close out for today. Thank you all so much for joining us. I just want to remind you that your voice is really incredibly important as we go through this session and for our work here in Augusta and throughout the state. We do hope that you'll join us on March 5th for State House Action Day. There have been some questions about how we are going to stay up to date, or how do we keep you up to date on what's happening. Again, our website and our legislative tracker is up there. We have a number of communications that go out, and there'll be some opportunities for you to engage in some webinars during the session. We'll do a post-session wrap-up. And we are launching, for those of you that want to be more deeply engaged in our climate work, a monthly climate call. The first one will be on February 1st, and that's led by Josh. So we hope you'll join us there. That will be a regular call that will have specific actions that you can take, both for what's happening in the session, but then what's happening outside of the session as well. As I close out, I really want to thank my colleagues here on the call for their incredible expertise, their work, and their commitment to our environment, and to all of you in the state of Maine. And somebody who doesn't get a shout out quite enough is Kristen Jackson. Just to acknowledge her, she manages all of this to allow us to speak directly to you. And Kristen, thank you for the skill and and work that you put into bringing us all together on these webinars. Again, you can find this recording of this on YouTube. Please share with your friends and family, and we hope to see you sometime here in Augusta or out in your communities. Have a great week, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Bye, thank you.